Next, we have Commissioner Lindsey. Commissioner Lindsey, welcome to the Committee on Ways and Means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about the Department of Human Rights and the potential proposal that's in the omnibus bill concerning a 30% cut to the Department of Human Rights. 50 years ago, Republican Governor Harold Levander, in his inauguration speech, asked the legislature to lead the nation on securing human rights for all, and he asked for the creation of the Department of Human Rights. And in his speech, he said the following: "We need people who want to follow the commandment, love one another, because our most critical problems are really people problems. We're going to have to do more to try to understand people. How do we encourage society to accept the former convict? How do we motivate underprivileged children? How do we create true harmony among the races? How do we assure our senior citizens of a meaningful life? The problem of a mature Minnesota reach beyond our towns, counties, and districts. They are problems for all of us. There is no clear-cut single answer to all of these problems. The issues are complex and elusive. In a word, however, I'm asking Minnesota to lead. If we in Minnesota can't create true racial harmony, we should ask no other state to do it." Those words were true 50 years ago. They are true today. The cuts to the Department of Human Rights take us a step backwards. The governor has been clear that in his statement to the legislature that he will veto any budget cut to any of his agencies, and especially in a time frame in which we have a surplus of over $320 million. One has to ask the question of why there would be a cut to the Department of Human Rights. This morning, I started with a meeting with the Minnesota Employers Fair Chance Hiring Group, Twin Cities Rise, Greater MSB, several corporations in town, international groups, large organizations like the Koch brothers as well, sponsored this effort to try and bridge the divide concerning individuals who need a second chance. More than 150 employers were there for the morning session. For the lunch session, we had more than 100 individual providers and organizations that came. This is the type of work that the department seeks to do. We seek to get into that space and provide guidance to help bridge divides that prevent people from realizing their true potential. This is an important time for us. There is significant demographic change which is occurring. In less than 15 years, 1 in 5 Minnesotans will be over the age of 65. No one who is listening to me now in this room by 2030 will ever know a Minnesota where there isn't 1 in 5 Minnesotans over the age of 65 for the rest of their life. Children that are in kindergarten will never know a Minnesota where 1 in 5 individuals weren't over the age of 65. That portends huge challenge for us to maximize the talent and the development of those children. We are also getting more diverse as it relates to race and ethnicity. In the Twin Cities region by 2035, more than 40% of the individuals will identify as a person of color. We need to be able to bridge the divide as it relates to age. We need to bridge the divide as it relates to race. We need more collaboration, more partnership. The department seeks to do that in its work. So I ask you, not because the governor is going to veto any potential bill that comes to him with a cut to the department, I ask you to assume the leadership that Governor Levander set forth 50 years ago for us to create and lead on human rights. This is important work. Let us be the North Star continuing going forward.
Okay, questions for Mr. Lindsey. And I think maybe what I'd like to start with, Commissioner, if I can, is I know there are other people here who wanted to testify and bring up this issue of disparities of suspensions and dismissals in school districts, and I know your department has been involved with us with that. You know, we have one additional commissioner, Commissioner Clybourne, that I guess I hadn't listed before, that had also requested to speak, and so we have 5 other testifiers for this bill in addition to yourself, and then another bill beyond this. And so I think given that Chair Anderson previously took testimony from some people on this topic in her committee, I think I'd like to just have you speak of it, and then we won't take other testimony given the late hour that we're at right now. But could you speak to that issue, Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, I just want to get clarity to speak to the issue of disparities in general or talking about suspensions and expulsions.
I guess I would say talking about suspensions and expulsions, because I think that your department's been involved in some of those actions or bringing actions with a number of school districts, or at least bringing questions to a number of school districts, and people here have questions about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, Ed Allies is in the audience, and they have several individuals who have signed up and expressed an interest to testify. In essence, I think what they and then other parents around the state would tell you is that they feel from time to time that their children are being treated differently when school officials make decisions concerning who to suspend. The Government Accounting Office at the federal level, in examining the decisions, more than 96,000 schools throughout the United States, has made similar findings in that children of color are being treated differently when suspension decisions are being made by school officials. When we take a look at the data, and all school districts are responsible for submitting their data to the Department of Education into a system called the Discipline Incident Reporting System, what we find is substantial disparities for Native American students and African American students. In the United States today, the difference as it relates to disparities for African American students to white students concerning suspensions is 3.5 to 1. In Minnesota, however, it is 8 times to 1. Yes. When we take a look at the disparities for Native American children across the country, we find devastating disparities at 5 to 1. But somehow in the state of Minnesota, we have doubled down on those disparities, and they're 10 to 1. So for the department, we did not stop there in just looking at the numbers of students that are being suspended. We sat down with the school districts and asked them about their process. We asked them about the training that they provided. We asked them how they interacted with parents. And what we found is that there was a lack of general oversight. There was inconsistency as it relates to training. There was inconsistency as it relates to data collection. One of the things that you can do as a school when you identify a kid for suspension is you can identify in one of 29 categories. One of those categories is other. So when we looked at some of the school districts, and that's not for all, but an appreciable number of them, some of them were identifying more than 100 of their suspensions year after year after year in the category of other. And there was no process by which they were trying to seek to analyze and understand why so many of their suspensions were being designated as other. That suggested to us that it was really intentional for schools to pay more attention to how they were going about the process of suspending students. Now, I know that there has been some questions raised. I appreciate the questions from Representative Anderson, so let me be clear on this. We are not saying that there should be a moratorium on suspensions, nor are we saying that there is only one way in which suspensions or corrective action strategies should be meted out by school districts. Without getting too deep into the woods as relates to strategies or plans or approaches by schools, I will just mention 3 just to give examples. Positive behavior intervention supports, innocent classroom, and restorative justice. So within those frameworks, there could be schools that might be using restorative justice. There might be another school that's using innocent classroom. The department is not dictating to schools that you must use innocent classroom over PBIS. That's a decision that still resides with the school district. But what we are asking for is that they implement their strategy with great fidelity. It is not something which you just simply identify and don't actually fulfill it faithfully. What we're asking for is faithful implementation. And I don't think that's too much for parents to not be involved in that conversation with their local school districts to make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Commissioner. Questions for Commissioner Lindsey. Representative Hornstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your work on dismissal disparities, and so many other issues. My question is, how will this cut? It's a 30% cut. You said. First of all, how will it affect your work on this particular issue, and then overall, how will it impact your mission?
Commissioner Lindsey.
Mr. Chair, representative members of the committee, it would be significant. It would be devastating to the department. A 30% cut will result in 18 individuals losing their positions within the department. That means the department would have fewer individuals than it did in 2011 when I started. Since I have started as commissioner, the legislature has given additional statutory responsibilities to the department, such as monitoring equal pay to ensure that women are paid fairly to men, ensuring second chance opportunities are given to individuals who are convicted, again hearkening back to Governor Levandra's call about taking care of individuals who've been formerly incarcerated. We would not be able to effectively do the ban-the-box work. We've also been given the responsibility to encourage emerging entrepreneurs, serving on the board with DEED. We also have been asked to partner with the Department of Education to address school bullying. So all four of those things have been added, and we would have fewer individuals. During the time that I have been commissioner, we have increased the number of audits, which we have done to seek to increase career pathways and employment opportunities. Most people know of this work because of our work in increasing workforce participation goals in construction. 2012, the actual participation rate for people of color was less than 11% in construction on the projects which we monitored. 2016, it had increased to 28%. For women working on the state capitol, we achieved about 18% of participation. Women, when we set out the goal in 2012, they were achieving about 3.5%. When we adjusted the workforce goal for women in 2017, it had increased to 9%. Those numbers are low for women, but they're moving in the right direction.
Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner, thank you. I'm coming into this issue new. I haven't been on the other committees where this has been discussed, and I'm actually a little puzzled. I mean, it's interesting to hear, and I know this issue about suspensions is a very serious one. It is in my community in Rochester, and it's a serious issue. And then we're talking about that, and then we're talking about a 30% proposed cut to your department. And I gather there must be a link between those two, and this maybe is a question more for Representative Anderson, but Representative Anderson, you started out presenting the bill saying that this was about some agencies being more accountable and streamlined. And I guess by streamlined, you just mean smaller, given that there's a 30% cut to this agency. And I would really like to hear your explanation, other than just the fact that you want to save money and you're just going to put it in there. I mean, this is really, really troubling, because I think that every Minnesotan who's honest about this has to realize that we have serious problems with equity in this state. And those problems are holding us back now, and they're going to hold us back more in the future if we don't get our arms around them. A lot of this just due to the demographic change that the commissioner was talking about. And I hear about this all over the place. We need workforce. We need people to be in the workforce. We need to make sure that everybody is kind of working and functioning at the top of their game. And where we have huge disparities in across a lot of different dimensions. In the area I work in, health, we have a lot of health disparities. We have educational disparities. We have economic disparities. We have employment disparities. It seems to me that we need a more robust Department of Human Rights than cutting it a third. I just don't get it. Maybe you can explain that to me.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Liebling, as part of the State Government Finance Committee, we've been reviewing this not just this year, but for several years, looking at the Minnesota Department of Human Rights budget. And when we heard or learned that the department had initiated on their own, without any complaint filed, to do this work, it caused us to puzzle of why are they spending their resources on something that had no complaint for this work when they have other responsibilities as part of their budget. And so then we asked the question, well, how much are you dedicating of your resources towards this project? And we got no answer from the department. And when we're putting together a budget and you're asking an agency to provide you with the financial data that we need to help us put together the budget, it makes it really hard when that agency refuses to respond to those questions.
Well,
Representative Liebling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know about what formal complaint there might have been, but I must tell you that in my community, there are a lot of people complaining. So this is a really real issue. I don't think the commissioner made it up. I can just tell you that from my own community. So, you know, this is really concerning because Representative Anderson, this whole issue, the space that he works in, is critical to the state. This isn't about him. This is about Minnesotans and what they expect of us. So, I mean, this is really, I think this is a thumb in the eye of a lot of people in this state, and not just the man sitting next to you, and not just the governor, but a lot of people. And I don't think it's going to be viewed, you know, with very warm feelings by lots and lots of people, even if it does get vetoed and doesn't happen. I'm just really disappointed in that, Representative Anderson.
Mr. Chair.
Chair Anderson.
And Representative Liebling, I'm really disappointed when an agency that I have purview over refuses to provide the financial data that the committee requests. I think that makes it really challenging for us as a committee to do our job.
All right, I have Representatives Loon, Murphy, Garofalo, and Drazkowski. And Commissioner, I guess if you want to speak at some point, I guess let me know.
Mr. Chair, if I could, just on the point concerning complaints, I believe when I was before Chair Anderson's committee, I did indicate to her that there was no one who had sworn out an administrative charge, but I had heard complaints from parents throughout the state concerning suspensions, and I think I even testified here earlier, is that this has been a concern which has been brought to my attention by parents within the state. One other thing I should say, it is clear that the commissioner can bring administrative charges on behalf of the state, and I have done so in the past, and I'll give a concrete example of that. There was a high school in which a senior official was engaged in sexual harassment and was engaging in predatory behavior of female students in the school. I didn't feel that it was appropriate to have a student sign their name and have their name identified in that charge, and therefore I brought a commissioner's charge on behalf of several female students in that high school. So it is not unprecedented for the commissioner to take such action.
Representative Loon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate your testimony, and I have not had a chance to have a face-to-face discussion. I apologize if some of my questions or maybe things you responded to in state government finance, I don't serve on that committee, but obviously whatever happens in our schools is of great interest to me as chair of the Education Finance Committee, and I think the issues that you bring up are ones that we have talked about at some length in our committee, and we have funded or placed money for schools to incorporate alternative behavioral strategies like PBIS that you mentioned, and other things to try to address more positive ways of redirecting student behavior and getting better outcomes for students. And I think those are all really important initiatives. And we've had a discipline working group as well that has tried to look at some of these issues. But, you know, some concerns have been raised about this process, and I guess I've been a little surprised that the Department of Education has not really been in contact with me about their involvement with this process. Obviously, they work with schools on a daily basis, and so has your office utilize the Department of Education or their expertise? What has been your involvement or their involvement in this process of whether it's those 43 schools that initially got communicated to by your office or others?
Commissioner Lindsey.
Mr. Chair, Representative, and members of the committee, in all aspects in which we initiate some type of open file or investigation, we utilize experts within that respective area. So in this one, that would not have been uncommon for us to reach out to the Department of Education and ask for information to help guide us within our investigation. That does not mean that there is a delegation of our responsibility to do investigations under the Act, but they are a resource that we might use. So to that extent, we have had conversations with the Department of Education concerning corrective action strategies such as PBIS. We have had conversations concerning DERS to make sure that we understand the discipline incident reporting system, and I'll give you a concrete example of that. So within DERS, it identifies for schools to identify the more serious physical offense as the reason for suspension. So if I were to, as a principal, suspend a student for fighting and then for verbal abuse, I wouldn't designate it as both of those within the DERS system. I would identify it as fighting. And we wanted to make sure that that was clear and how that was communicated to schools.
Representative Loon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for that. And so it sounds like you may have consulted with the Department of Education, but you are sort of conducting this investigation or these actions on your own, and maybe at times doing some coordinating activities with the Department of Education?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I want to be clear on this, that the initiation of the investigation belongs to the Department of Human Rights. To the extent that we consult or get information from the Department of Education, this is not a joint effort between the two of us. And I think that that's important. It is an effort by the Department of Human Rights.
Representative Loon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. So then within your department, obviously, again, you're dealing with, young children and school districts, and that you have then experts or people with experience within your department working on this investigation that is knowledgeable about discipline strategies and different, I'll just refer to them as curriculum or programs for addressing discipline issues with students, because they, schools have to deal with this on a daily basis. So do you have experts within your department in this area?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we believe that we have adequate resources to be able to ascertain whether they're implementing it correctly. So from that vantage point, yes. But I want to go back to a point. We're not in a position, nor would we feel it appropriate, to dictate to the school district that they'd have to use a particular strategy. That is a local control issue for the school district to implement. To that extent, there are a wide variety of areas in which we investigate, and we are seeking to determine whether there is a differentiation, a disparate treatment between people and how programs, policies are being implemented. That does not necessarily mean that we have to be subject matter experts to the same degree of which we are investigating a group. So for example, if I were to investigate a hospital concerning its operations, concerning whether they were providing similar care to individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing when they're communicating about emergency procedures, I don't have to necessarily know all about the respective emergency procedures to know if there's a differentiation in treatment. So when we had the finding against Fairview that they were providing inconsistent treatment or inconsistent translators and inconsistent information to deaf and hard of hearing individuals, I felt that that was appropriate for us to make that determination.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, just a
Representative
couple
Loon.
of other questions, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your indulgence. Commissioner, then, so you're not advocating any particular model policy for schools. Are you offering them a range of particular policies you'll hope they'll adopt, or some guidance on discouraging them from choosing a method or methods over others in terms of trying to address the disparities that you've identified?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative and members of the committee, I believe what you're asking is, are we saying that there is one way in which for a school district to be successful? And the answer is no. And I'll use an example concerning the space that we provide advice and we regulate the activity of state contractors. There are many ways for you to create a culture of diversity and inclusion for women. We are not saying that there is only one way in which to do that. Just was downstairs testifying concerning sexual harassment. So to the extent that employers have a sexual harassment policy, there can be many different ways in which that could be written. Yes, we want to make sure there's a baseline for that, but how employers do that, that is up to them. How do they create a culture that women are seen, heard, and are in a position to be their full self at their place of employment and also be in position for promotion? Again, there are many ways in which that can be done. The department can provide some guidance to respective employers, but it's not dictating that there's only one way in which for that to be occurring.
Representative Lewin.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner, well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that because, again, I think our approach generally within the Education Committee on many things that we initiate with schools is to offer them some latitude and locally to try to determine these decisions, because oftentimes when we try to create one particular way or model, it doesn't work for every school, and we sure hear about it. And so I'm glad and hope that that will be the case with that. The schools will still feel free to try things. I talk with schools on a daily basis, and I know many of them are really working to how do they address, again, in a positive way, behavior issues in children. How do we help redirect? How do we try to make sure then that that doesn't happen again and everybody goes off in the right way and on to be successful? And we do have some, we had the Education Finance Omnibus Bill on the floor this afternoon, and there are some discipline policies in there, some coming from the governor, and we did make a few tweaks. But one of the things I have concerns about, and the reason I ask about policies, is there's a lot of discussion about not removing students from the classroom when they're disruptive, and basically trying to reinforce that we want the students to be in the classroom. And yes, generally we do, but when issues arise where a student is very disruptive, whether it's a physical threat to other students in there or just one where the teacher cannot continue to present the lesson or the learning going on, if there is an effort to try to remove the authority or the discretion of the teacher to say, maybe this student needs to go have a conversation with someone else in the building right now so I can continue with my lesson, I am concerned about efforts to curtail that, because you have probably 20 some other students in that classroom who also have a right to continue learning and that. And so that is a balance that schools have to address, and it's a difficult one. I'll grant you that, and I think schools have a tough job on some of these issues. But I didn't know if you had a particular point of view on that, because again, it's one where I really want to respect the authority of teachers who also have a tough job. And I'm not advocating for suspension or removal of the school from these students, but maybe students just need time to talk out whatever issues are troubling them that day with someone else, and not in a classroom where 20 some other kids are trying to learn math or history or whatever they're on.
Okay, and I guess if I can have you answer that or give your comments, Commissioner, then I think we need to probably move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner.
I appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, Representative, members of the committee, that's a fantastic question. First off, what I heard you saying, in that you want to try and create an environment for innovation to occur. We concur with that assessment. We're trying to create an environment for innovation to occur and trying to have the school district share best practices and learn from one another. And we've heard from many of them that they appreciate the fact that we're trying to create that space for them. The second thing which you talked about is what's a suspension? And I don't think I was very clear for the committee, so I want to be crystal clear on this. When I was talking about that data, I'm talking about a student being out of school for the entire day. So the idea of a student being removed from the classroom for 15 or 20 minutes would not be a suspension which would be reported to the Department of Education. And I'll even go further. If you're a general education student and you are told to go home after the third period of the day and you come back to school the next day, that's not a suspension which is reported by the Department of Education. So to that extent, we're really talking about a full lost academic day. And what I would also share with the committee is that there are a lot of parents that are talking about their students being segregated for 4 or 5 hours and not just having a 20-minute timeout conversation in the hallway, kind of being forgotten within their schools. Now, fortunately, that's not happening every day in all of our schools, but I will share with this committee, it is apparently happening enough that there are a lot of parents that have raised that concern with the department. And it's one that we take seriously and make sure that that's being addressed. To the 20-minute issue, we have toured various schools, met with them. We'd like to see, and we've appreciated the strategies in which they try to de-escalate situations by bringing a student out. As somebody who's officiated at a very high level with players much bigger than me on the field, there are sometimes you have to try and de-escalate situations, but you may get into a situation in which you have to tell somebody that's it for the day. What we heard from schools is that they're trying their very best to try and figure out how to strike that right balance. The numbers are saying that they're not striking it quite correctly. Let's work together to figure it out.
Right, and thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. I appreciate your indulgence.
Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, could you please repeat for me, because I also have not been a part of these discussions till now, but can you please repeat for me the statistics that the Minnesota-specific statistics that you shared with us about suspensions for Minnesota children of color?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative. So what the department did is we took a look at 5 years' worth of data that had been submitted by schools to the Department of Education within DERS. And when we met with school districts at the late October, early November, the most recent year that had been submitted and which was public was 2015-2016. And looking at that data, African-American students comprise slightly more than 10% of the total populations of students in Minnesota public schools. But as it relates to the group of kids being suspended, they comprise 41% of all kids suspended in Minnesota. When you calculate out what that would mean in comparison to students that would identify as white, not of Hispanic origin, that would be of a function of 8 times to 1. When you take a look at the national data would be 3.5 to 1. For Native American students, the suspension rate in the state of Minnesota is 10 times to 1. And at national level, it's a discouraging number because it's 5 times to 1, but somehow we have managed to double that discouraging number.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Murphy.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner, that is one of too many statistics about Minnesota and racial disparities, and from my perspective, an example of institutional or structural racism and bias that I think for Minnesota's future we have to contend with. And I heard Chair Anderson, I guess a couple of times in the course of this conversation, talk about her frustration with asking you for information and not getting what she wanted as a rationale for the 30% cut to the budget. But it sure seems to me that those numbers that reflect the way that our children are being treated is a signal that we as policymakers have work to do. And by punishing the Department of Human Rights, we are actually punishing Minnesota children who are already They're already experiencing what is an embarrassing disparity. And so I appreciate you being here at this late hour. I wish the parents that were here were able to testify. But this is exceptionally distressing. This deep cut, and it is in a bill that is, full of a power grab from my perspective in the first place. And, I don't like this bill very much, but this is stunning. And if we have an interest in our future and our kids, this can't stand. And I sure hope before this bill comes out of this committee, Chair Knobloch, that we rectify this, because this is not a good story coming out of the Minnesota legislature for the people of Minnesota.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner. Thank you for being available this late hour. You had mentioned the data and the disparities based off of race. How did the level of suspensions rate based on gender?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative, members of the committee, we did not break it out by gender. We do know that there are some disparities. More students that are male are suspended than females.
Representative Garofalo.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioner, what does that tell you?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative, members of the committee, I think what that tells me is that there are some issues concerning how some schools approach male students to female students, but the numbers of suspensions for the respective schools when we examined for race and disability, they were not, the disparities between males and females were not as significant as what we were seeing for individual disabilities or with race. So there are some differences by male to female, but when you control for race, you don't see substantial disparities between male students and female students.
Mr.
Representative Garofalo.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioner, my understanding was that male students were 9 times as likely to be suspended as female students. Is that not correct?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative, when I said control for race, so just so we're very clear, the student that is most often suspended is an African-American male student. And the student that's also most likely to be suspended is a Native American male student. So if you're asking the question concerning trying to discern race from just gender, it is very difficult to ascertain that, because once you take a look at race as to who is suspended, it is typically students of color, and it is typically male students of color.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Garofalo.
Commissioner, I'm not disputing that, but correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the data show that white male students are suspended 9 times as often as white female students?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative, I do not believe that that is the case.
Okay.
Representative
Mr. Chairman,
Garofalo.
would it be possible to get this data? Would it take a lot of labor effort to get that data based on gender? Because if the information I've been given is incorrect, I want to know that. But my understanding and the data I've been given is that young boys, these
Right.
male students are far more likely to be suspended than female students, which would tell us that perhaps racism is not, we're looking at the wrong thing there. There's several factors that are playing into this, especially if it's breaking down where it's consistent based on race. But if you could get that data, that would be helpful. And Commissioner, I would say that there's no doubt in Minnesota that we have disparities. We have big-time disparities in gender, racial, geographic, and it's in education, employment, criminal justice. And the state of Minnesota and the taxpayers in Minnesota spend a lot of money trying to reduce those disparities. We spend a lot of money doing that. And it's clear that some of these programs are not working. Is part of the purview of the Department of Human Rights to identify programs that are not working in addressing the disparities problem?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, representative, to your first point, I just want to be very clear that if you're talking about the suspension rate of all students, African Americans make up 41% of all the suspensions. So when you start talking about male students to female students. You just have to appreciate that just at the very beginning of that analysis, that students of color represent more than half of the students that are being suspended year in and year out. Is close to 65 to 70%. So I appreciate what you're trying to do to untangle sort of the concept of gender with race. But if you're talking about the totality of students that are suspended, the profile of a student that's being suspended is a Native American or African American male student. To your question concerning, is it the jurisdiction statutorily for the Department of Human Rights to do an assessment concerning programs which are seeking to aid to address disparities? The Act calls upon us to investigate disparities, but there is no statutory obligation for us to do a full-fledged assessment of all the efforts which are being undertaken by the state.
Mr. Chairman, that's my final comment. I think,
Representative Garofalo.
again, we have a lot of money being spent by the taxpayers in the state to reduce disparities, a lot of it. And whenever we have examples of disparities, disparity programs not working, we are given one solution by the advocates of these programs, and that is that we're not spending enough money. Very rarely do we see changes in policy or the recommendation that programs be shut down and those dollars being prioritized. And I think of the Office of the Legislative Auditor model. I would like to see that somehow incorporated into the Department of Human Rights, where you could say, here's programs that taxpayers are spending money on to reduce geographic disparities or racial disparities. They're just not working. So a little bit off topic, just my thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, then I'm going to recognize Representative Drazkowski, and then I think we need to move on to other witnesses. Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and Representative Anderson, for your good bill. Commissioner, you know, it sounds like, I'm looking at your website here, and your quote says, "School discipline is about teaching students what is expected of them and helping them find success, ensuring that a healthy learning environment exists, and properly supporting teachers, not about punishing a student." And it sounds like, Commissioner, you're becoming a superintendent here. You know, we have, as Representative Garofalo was saying, we've got different, we've got schools and superintendents and school boards looking after discipline in their schools. We've got the Department of Education, and now we've got the Department of Human Rights. Can you tell us more how you got involved in this? It sounded, your description sounded like mission creep to me.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, the quote that you read from the website actually came from the conversations we had with superintendents. So what I was saying within that quote is that I had heard superintendents, and within that quote, I was trying to honor the dialogue conversation that we had. I didn't come up with that language all by myself. That, again, was in that conversation with superintendents. Concerning the mission creep, it is clearly stated within the Human Rights Act, it's 363(a)(13), about suspensions or expulsions of students, and if there is disparities there, that falls within the jurisdiction of the department. So I do not believe there's mission creep. To Representative Garofalo's offer concerning giving additional funding to the department to take a look at things, I appreciate that, but I hope that it comes with some money as well. Again, earlier tonight, there was testimony downstairs asking for the department to weigh in on sexual harassment. So again, I say that there are issues for us to deal with, but we're trying to be intentional about it.
Representative Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, it sounds like you guys have the ability to kind of go wherever you want, depending on somebody who complains about something. It seems pretty broad and wide open to me. I'd be more curious. I don't know a lot about the Department of Human Rights or your scope or your charge or what the statutes say. Certainly, Chair Anderson does and was asking you questions about it. Commissioner, why didn't you respond to the committee and Chair Anderson?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative, to your question concerning the scope of the department, the jurisdiction set forth by this legislature, again, going back to Governor Levander 50 years ago, was set forth very broadly. public accommodations, public services, housing, employment. Those are all contained within the Human Rights Act. So to this extent, if we think about it, to have a fully functioning democracy and ensure that civil rights are protected for all, the department would have to have broad rights to ensure that those rights are protected for individuals. To the extent that the information which was requested, I have shared 2 letters to Representative Anderson attempting to answer the questions that she has of the department concerning the investigation. I appreciate that there's additional information that she would like, but I am also bound by the Government Data Practices Act, and these are open files, and I'm not at liberty to provide all the information. She's asked for some information concerning how many individuals have worked on this respective endeavor. Once we close those files, I'm more than happy to provide all of that information.
Well, Mr. Chair and
Representative Drazkowski.
and Commissioner, maybe we have found the answer. Maybe we need to look at what the role of the Department of Human Rights is and start to narrow that scope so that it has a better focus rather than one that seems to be wide open. I think Chair Anderson's bill attempts to maybe start to address that. And by the way, Chair Anderson, a great bill, one that starts to rein in some of not only this particular line item, but others as well. And I think if we look up and down our government, we spend so much in this huge government we have. We got to start to remove some of the redundancies. And thank you for your work, Chair Anderson.
All right. Commissioner, I want to thank you for your testimony, and I do want to say again to the parents here, people who are with Ed Allies, we've been talking about this topic for almost an hour, and it is a very important topic, and I do think that a lot of times hearing personal stories are really important too, but I know that, or I am informed that there was testimony in Chair Anderson's State Government Finance Committee from some people on this. We have had a great deal of testimony and discussion right now with the Commissioner on this, and I'm afraid that we have 5 other commissioners with departments to testify tonight, as well as another bill on our agenda. And so just given the late hour, I just feel like given the time we have spent with Commissioner Lindsey, it's appropriate now to move on. But I do thank you and do want to say that, I certainly am concerned about this issue, and I appreciate being able to learn more about it. Thank you, Commissioner. And I think Representative Hornstein, you said you had a question for me?
For you, yeah. So I have a couple more questions on this topic, not necessarily for the Commissioner, but to the author. Would you prefer that we just hold those till after the rest of the testimony, or just keep it on this topic? What would you prefer?
I think, why don't we just keep it on, why don't you ask those questions now, and then we can finish off this topic.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just noticed on page 6, lines 28 to 31, it states in the bill that the amount of the cut may not be used to reduce operations or services in the department's regional office in St. Cloud. And I sponsored back in March 2015 House File 1364, and that bill was successful. We were able to fund offices in Rochester, St. Cloud, and Duluth. And so I'm just wondering, Representative Anderson, why would you cut in Rochester and Duluth, but not in St. Cloud?
Chair Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Hornstein, the St. Cloud office is the newest office. And so in order for that to be able to maintain and make progress in the issues that they're doing there, I felt that they needed to be able to be protected from any reductions that may occur.
Representative Hornstein.
Okay, well, I think that this was really important for communities outside of the Twin Cities to have these offices, and I think they play a really important role. And so I'm concerned about that. And I guess just a very quick final comment and observation. We've had some disturbing reports nationally. The Anti-Defamation League has said that anti-Semitism is now up 60% incidence over last year. We have an increase of 15% of hate crimes and bias towards the Muslim community. Similar reports also for all people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ community, and just given what's happening in the country now, Mr. Chair and members, this seems like the last thing we should be doing now is cutting a human rights office that really is responsible for, addressing so much, not only disparities, but these bias crimes that so many communities are feeling, and so many communities feel fearful and have to address. There's something going on in the country now that I think is concerning, it's disturbing, and this needs to be this money, I think, needs to be restored somehow or the other. And I went, just last thing, Mr. Chair, during the break, I went to Memphis. There was the 50th anniversary of the killing of Dr. King. And it's interesting that this is also the 50th anniversary of the Department of Human Rights. A lot was going on in the country then, and on this topic. And, I was reflecting on how much progress we've made as a result of the work of the civil rights movement and Dr. King. But yet, it concerns me that when we take these steps backwards, and that's kind of what this feels to me. So I hope that we will really reconsider this cut. I'm again concerned about the regional offices, and I do appreciate, Mr. Chair, you were very helpful in that, as I recall, helping establish these offices in Rochester, St. Cloud, and Duluth. So I'm especially concerned about, cutting those two offices, and as well as the entire 30% cut here. So, as Representative Murphy said, let's re-examine this.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just for clarifying the record.
Commissioner,
Thank you. The department only has 2 offices. We have an office in St. Paul and then an office in St. Cloud. The governor asked for these regional offices. They weren't funded.
I see. Okay, thank you. Well, let's fund those too, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.